Anchored to the Wind, a Frontier Family Saga. These aren't legends. They were my family. These are their stories. They crossed frontiers, survived wars, and helped build the place that we call home. Several days had passed since the harvest gathering. On the Horton farm, life settled quickly back into its familiar rhythm. Long before the sun climbed above the ridges of Sand Mountain, Preston's forge already was ringing with the steady sound of hammer against iron. Thin curls of smoke drifted from the chimney as another day of work began. Inside the cabin, Betsy was already preparing breakfast. Beans simmered in a black iron pot to be ready for the noon meal. And as she mixed the biscuit dough, she quietly hummed a hymn she had known for years. It wasn't something she thought about. It was simply part of her day, as natural as breathing. Outside, Palestine stepped into the cool morning air, carrying 2 empty wooden buckets, walking toward the family well. Like every member of the Horton family, her day had begun long before breakfast. There were eggs to gather from the hen house, kindling to bring in for the cook fire, water to draw from the well. The younger brother and sisters always seemed to need something. On a frontier farm, there was no shortage of work. With a house full of children, everyone had responsibilities. And with no older brothers, the older girls carried much of the daily work. Balancing a full bucket in each hand, she started back toward the cabin when the morning sunlight caught tiny drops of dew scattered across a spider's web stretched between 2 fence rails. She stopped just for a moment. She had passed that fence hundreds of times, yet today she noticed how every tiny drop of water reflected the rising sun. A honeybee drifted lazily from blossom to blossom near the herb garden. She watched it disappear into the flowers before lifting away again, dusted with golden pollen. Without realizing it, she smiled. Ever since the church gathering, she found herself looking at things differently, not because the mountain had changed, because she had. Questions filled her thoughts. Why did rosemary stay green when other plants faded? Why did mint always seem happiest beside cool water? Why did some plants grow only in the shade? Then she remembered the gentle voice of the older woman outside the little church. Before you gather a plant, you should always know its story. The words had stayed with her. Palestine, her mother's voice carried from the kitchen. Would you please snip a few sprigs of rosemary for the stew? Yes, Mama. She stepped into the herb garden and knelt beside the sturdy rosemary bush. Without thinking, she reached to cut several long branches. Then she paused, smiling to herself. She clipped only the few tender sprigs that her mama had asked for. Take only as much as the mountain is willing to spare. Her mother's words seemed richer now than they had only a week before. She gently rubbed one of the rosemary leaves between her fingers. Its clean, earthy fragrance lingered in the cool morning air. I wonder what your story is, she whispered. She returned to the cabin, and Betsy glanced into the basket. Then her eyes moved out to the rosemary bush, still standing healthy and full. She looked back at Palestine. She didn't say a word. She simply smiled. Somehow that smile meant more than words. Later that morning, after the breakfast dishes had been washed and the younger children were busy with their own chores, Palestine carried a bucket of water to the forge. She sat it down near her pa's work area. She picked up a small bucket of iron nails Preston had finished the evening before. He was already shaping another piece of glowing iron, and without looking up, he smiled. "Morning, little dove." "Morning, Pa." For a few moments she simply watched him work. Finally Preston chuckled. "You've been carrying more than water this morning." She looked puzzled. "A penny for your thoughts." She smiled. "I suppose I have." After a moment she asked quietly, "Pa, have you ever met someone who made you see things differently?" Preston rested his hammer on the anvil. He pressed the now formed piece of iron into a nearby bucket of water. Steam curled upward as he cooled the iron. He looked toward the mountain for a long moment before answering. "More than once." Then he smiled. "The Lord has a way of bringing the right people into our lives just when we're ready to learn from them." The ringing of the hammer began again, but Palestine hardly heard it. She carried those words with her the rest of the day. The morning slipped steadily toward midday. Harvest time was one of the busiest seasons on the Horton farm. Winter would come soon enough, and there was still much to do before the first hard frost settled across Sand Mountain. At the clothesline, Palestine and her sister Alabama worked side by side, hanging freshly washed homespun shirts, dresses, and aprons. The cool autumn breeze tugged gently as the sisters fastened each one with smooth wooden pegs Pa had whittled during quiet evenings beside the fire. Near the cabin, another sister, Dicey, carried armloads of split oak to the wood box beside the hearth. On the front porch, younger sister Tennessee swept away the fallen leaves the morning breeze had scattered across the rough-hewn boards. Nearby, older sister Martha shelled dried beans into a large wooden bowl, stopping every now and then to laugh at something that Tennessee said. The younger children gathered warm brown eggs from beneath hens, laughing each time one of the birds protested their interruption. No one stood idle. On a frontier farm, every pair of hands mattered. As the last of the laundry was hung, Betsy stepped out onto the porch and looked toward her daughters. "Palestine, Alabama." "Yes, Mama," they answered together. "Take your baskets and start gathering corn. Your pa wants another load in the crib before evening." "Yes, Mama." Each girl picked up a woven basket and started toward the cornfield. The drying stalks rustled softly in the autumn breeze. The ears had filled well that summer, and Palestine smiled as she looked across the field. "The Lord surely blessed the corn this year." Alabama looked across the rows and smiled. "He surely did. We'll have plenty put by for winter." As they passed the little herb garden beside the cabin, Palestine slowed her steps. Her eyes wandered from the rosemary to the sage, and then to the mint, growing near the edge of the garden. Only a week before, they had simply been herbs. Now she found herself wondering why rosemary seemed content in the dry sunshine, why mint always reached towards the damp ground, and why the Lord had given each one its own place to grow. Almost without realizing it, she smiled. "Before you gather a plant, you should know its story." Those quiet words still lingered in her heart. The sisters continued on until they reached the cornfield. The dry leaves rustled as they snapped the ripe ears of corn from the stalks and tossed them into their baskets. For a while, only the sounds of harvest filled the air, the rustle of the corn leaves, the distant ring of Preston's hammer at the forge, the laughter of the children that carried on through the breeze. Then a long, desperate bawl echoed across the pasture. Both girls stopped. The cry came again, longer this time, filled with pain. Palestine looked toward Alabama. That doesn't sound right. Alabama listened carefully. No, it sounds like one of Pa's heifers. The bawl came again, even louder, even more desperate. The steady ringing of Preston's hammer suddenly stopped. The peaceful rhythm of Horton Farm had been broken. Across the yard, Preston stepped quickly from the forge, and he looked toward the pasture. He watched for only a moment before striding across the farm. As he came alongside the edge of the cornfield, he called, "Little Dove?" Palestine looked up immediately. "I need your help." Without hesitation, she dropped an ear of corn into the basket and hurried after him, leaving Alabama watching silently as the frightened bawls echoed across the autumn pasture once again. Palestine hurried after her father as they crossed the pasture. The frightened bawls grew louder with every step. When they reached the far fence, a pregnant young red heifer lay on her side, her breathing deep and labored. Her flanks rose and fell with every painful contraction. She strained with all her strength, then cried out again. Palestine had seen calves born before, but never like this. Without a word, Preston knelt beside the frightened animal. He rested one weathered hand gently along her neck. "Easy now, girl." The heifer continued breathing hard, her sides trembling with exhaustion. She trusted him enough to become still between contractions. Preston watched quietly through another hard push. He rolled his sleeves higher. Slowly, he reached his arm inside the birth canal. Palestine watched in silence. She had never imagined anyone could reach that far. The heifer groaned beneath the effort. Preston closed his eyes as his fingers searched carefully. Time seemed to stand still. Finally, he slowly withdrew his arm. His face had grown serious. "The little feller's front legs are folded back." He looked toward the exhausted heifer as another deep breath escaped her. "If we can't get 'em turned," he paused only for a moment, "we could lose both of 'em." Palestine felt her stomach tighten. She looked at the struggling heifer, then back at her father. There wasn't the slightest panic in his face, only quiet determination. He simply nodded toward the animal. "Let's see what we can do." Once again he reached inside, patiently, carefully, working one tiny hoof forward, then the other. The heifer breathed heavily between the contractions, gathering what little strength she had left. Several long minutes passed, and finally Preston nodded. "That's better." From a leather pouch hanging on the fence, he removed a length of clean rope. Carefully, he reached inside once more and tied the rope securely around the calf's tiny front legs. Only after the rope was in place did he pull a pair of worn leather gloves from his back pocket and put them on his hands. He handed a second pair to Palestine. She slipped them on. Preston handed her the loose end of the rope. "When she pushes, we pull." Palestine nodded. She wrapped both gloves round the rope, and the next contraction came. The heifer bawled loudly. Now! Father and daughter leaned back together. The rope stretched tight, but nothing moved. Preston immediately eased the strain. The heifer drew several deep breaths before another contraction slowly began. Again they pulled. Again, nothing. The calf refused to move. Preston looked toward the sturdy oak standing only a few feet away. Quietly, he took the loose end of the rope and he wrapped it once around the trunk. He looked toward Palestine. This'll give us the upper hand on him. Both of them took hold once more. The heifer drew another long breath, then pushed with everything she had. Pull! Their heels dug deep into the earth. The rope tightened against the oak. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The only sounds were the heifer's heavy breathing and the strain of the rope. Then, almost too slowly to notice, the tiny front legs began to move. There we go. Preston never raised his voice. The heifer pushed again. Father and daughter leaned backward with all of their strength. Slowly, the calf's shoulders slipped free. One more contraction. One more steady pull. The little calf slid onto the grass. Everything became quiet. Neither Preston nor Palestine moved. The exhausted heifer lay still, breathing deeply. Preston quickly knelt beside the calf. He cleared its nose and mouth, then rubbed its sides with both hands. 1 heartbeat. 2. 3. The little calf drew a shallow breath, then another. A weak cough. Finally, a strong cry echoed across the pasture. Palestine smiled with relief. Preston gently rubbed the calf one last time before walking to a nearby creek by the edge of the woods. He washed the birth from his arms and his hands. Behind them, the exhausted heifer struggled to her feet. Still trembling, she walked directly to her calf, and without hesitation, she began licking him clean. Palestine watched quietly. A smile spread across her face. She knows just what to do. Preston nodded. The Lord built that into her. For a long moment, father and daughter stood together watching the little calf wobble until it got onto its feet. Neither of them noticed the older woman standing quietly beneath the tree at the edge of the pasture. A woven basket rested on her arm. She had seen everything. She hadn't been watching the calf. She had been watching Palestine, and what she had seen pleased her. The little calf wobbled uncertainly on long, awkward legs. His mother nudged him gently with her nose, encouraging him toward his first meal. Preston smiled. He'll do just fine now. Palestine watched the calf for another moment before helping her father coil the rope. Neither of them had noticed the older woman standing quietly beneath the trees. She waited until Preston had finished coiling the rope. Then she stepped slowly from the shade. Preston looked up first. A warm smile spread across his face. Afternoon, Aunt Hester. Afternoon, Preston. Her eyes drifted toward the young heifer. Looks like y'all had your hands full. We surely did. Preston glanced toward the little calf, now nursing beside his mother. But the Lord was good to us today. He surely was, Aunt Hester replied. Only then did she turn toward Palestine. The young girl smiled. "Afternoon, ma'am." Aunt Hester smiled warmly. "Afternoon, child." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Hester nodded toward the calf. "You stayed." Palestine looked puzzled. I couldn't rightly leave." Hester's smile grew just a little. "No, I didn't reckon you would." She glanced toward Preston. "You've taught her well." Preston rested one hand on the fence rail. "Oh, she's still got plenty to learn." Aunt Hester chuckled softly. "Don't we all?" She shifted the basket slightly on her arm. "I was headed home." She looked toward Palestine. "If you finish your chores tomorrow, meet me right here after dinner." Palestine's eyes widened. "You mean you'd show me the plants?" Aunt Hester smiled. "I'll show you where to begin." She turned and started back towards the woods. After only a few steps, she paused. Without looking back, she said quietly, "Wear sturdy shoes. The mountain has a way of testing folks." Then she disappeared among the autumn trees. Palestine watched until she was completely out of sight. Finally, she looked towards her father. "Pa?" He smiled before she could finish. "I reckon you've got yourself a teacher." Palestine looked once more towards the quiet woods. Somehow, she felt tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The following afternoon, Palestine finished her chores as quickly as she could. She checked with her mother before leaving. "I've finished feeding the chickens, and Tennessee helped me gather the eggs." Betsy smiled. "I know where you're headed." Palestine grinned. "I won't be gone any longer than I need to." Betsy gently straightened a loose strand of her daughter's hair. "Mind Aunt Hester." "I will." "And remember, the mountain isn't yours." Palestine smiled. "It belongs to the Lord." Betsy nodded. "And we're simply its caretakers." With a woven basket over one arm, Palestine started toward the edge of the woods where she had met Aunt Hester the day before. Aunt Hester was already waiting. "Afternoon, child." "Afternoon, Aunt Hester." Hester smiled. "I see you wore your sturdy shoes." Palestine looked down and laughed. "I figured you meant it." "I surely did." Without another word, Aunt Hester turned and started walking. Palestine hurried to catch up. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Only the crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet disturbed the quiet woods. Finally, Palestine couldn't help herself. "Aren't we looking for plants?" "We are. But first," Aunt Hester stopped beside a towering white oak. "We're learning to see." She rested one hand against the rough bark. "What do you notice?" Palestine looked around. "The trees are changing colors." "They are. What else?" She looked longer this time. "The ground's damp here." Hester nodded. "Why?" Palestine wasn't sure. "The trees keep the sun off of it." "They do. And what kind of plants might like cool, damp places?" Palestine's eyes brightened. "The mint!" A smile crossed Hester's face. "Now you're beginning to ask the right questions." They walked a little further. Hester knelt beside a small patch of goldenrod. She didn't touch it. "What do you see?" Palestine knelt beside her. "A bee? Anything else?" She watched quietly. "It keeps coming back to the same flowers." Hester nodded. "The Lord teaches, if we're willing to watch." After a long silence, Palestine finally asked the question that had been waiting in her heart. "Aunt Hester, how do you learn all of this?" Hester smiled softly. "From someone older than me." "And how did she learn it?" "From someone older than her." She looked out through the trees for longer than anyone remembers. Then she looked back at Palestine. "Knowledge like this isn't owned, it's carried." The words settled deeply into Palestine's heart. Hester rose to her feet and picked a single goldenrod blossom. She placed it gently into Palestine's basket. "Never forget, the Lord made this plant long before either one of us was born. We're not here to master His creation. We're here to understand it and to care for it." Palestine looked at the single flower resting in the bottom of her basket. One flower, not an armful, just one. She smiled. "I think I'm beginning to understand." Aunt Hester smiled. "No, child, you've just begun." Together they disappeared deeper into the autumn woods. The woods grew quieter as Aunt Hester led Palestine farther beneath the tall oaks. Sunlight filtered through branches painted with the colors of autumn. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Aunt Hester walked with a slow, deliberate step, stopping now and then to study a tree, a patch of moss, or a cluster of leaves. Palestine finally smiled. "I thought we'd be gathering plants." "We are." Aunt Hester continued walking. "Just not now." Palestine looked puzzled, but said nothing more. After a while, they reached a small clearing where a basket rested beneath a fallen log. Aunt Hester picked it up and slipped the handle over her arm. She said, "I'll carry this." Together they continued through the woods. Every so often, Aunt Hester stopped to gather something: a handful of yarrow, a few sprigs of mint growing beside a trickling stream, several leaves of the plantain from that edge of the game trail. Each time she harvested only a little, never taking all that grew there. Palestine noticed she always left the strongest plants standing. Finally she asked, "Why don't you gather more while we're here?" Aunt Hester smiled without looking up. "Because I expect to come back." Those simple words settled into Palestine's heart. They walked a little farther. Aunt Hester stopped beside a cluster of plants growing in the shade. She pointed. "Tell me what you notice." Palestine knelt. "The ground's cooler here." "It is." "The soil's damp." "It is." "The sun don't stay here very long." Aunt Hester nodded. "And yet, those plants are healthy." Palestine studied them for a long moment. "They're growing where the Lord made a place for 'em." A slow smile spread across Aunt Hester's face. "Now you're seeing." Aunt Hester knelt beside the small cluster of plants and set her basket on the ground. From inside, she removed a small hand trowel, worn smooth from years of use. She brushed away the fallen leaves with gentle fingers. Watch closely. Carefully, she loosened the rich, damp soil several inches away from the stem, working her way around the plant instead of digging straight beneath it. Slowly, she lifted the earth a little at a time. At last, a pale, forked root emerged from the dark mountain soil. She cradled it in her hand as though it were something precious. This is sang. Palestine leaned closer. It doesn't look like much. Aunt Hester smiled. Most treasures don't. She gently brushed the soil from the root. The Lord tucks some of his greatest gifts where only patient folks are likely to find them. She held the root out for Palestine to see, but did not place it in her hand. If I'd hurried, I'd have cut this root clean through. She laid the ginseng carefully into her basket. Once it's damaged, you can't make it whole again. For the next hour, Palestine carried the basket, while Aunt Hester gathered only a few plants from each place that they visited. Sometimes they talked, but often they didn't. The quiet never felt uncomfortable. Finally, as the afternoon sun settled lower in the sky, Aunt Hester stopped walking. She took the basket from Palestine. It wasn't very heavy. Palestine looked disappointed. That's all? Aunt Hester smiled kindly. For today. I thought I'd learn more. You did. Palestine looked puzzled. Hester said, I never told you today's lesson. What was it? Aunt Hester rested her basket against her hip. I wanted to see if you could follow without needing every question answered. Palestine thought about the long afternoon. She had wanted to ask 100 questions, but instead she had watched, listened, and waited. Aunt Hester smiled. Knowledge comes easier than patience, and patience comes first. As they turned toward home, Palestine glanced once more at the little patches of herbs scattered through the woods. Yesterday she had only seen plants. Today she had begun to see a pattern, and somehow she knew that she had only taken the first step. The sun hung low over Sand Mountain as Palestine and Aunt Hester made their way toward the Horton farm. The woods glowed with the warm colors of late afternoon. Neither hurried, and at the edge of the trees, Aunt Hester stopped. You know the way from here. Yes, ma'am. Aunt Hester smiled. I'll expect you after dinner tomorrow. I'll be here. I know. For a moment they stood in comfortable silence. Then Aunt Hester gave a small nod. Go on home. Palestine smiled and started across the pasture. Partway across she stopped. She looked back. Aunt Hester was still standing at the edge of the woods, watching. When Palestine waved, Aunt Hester lifted one hand in return before disappearing quietly beneath the trees. The familiar sounds of home greeted her. The rhythmic ring of Preston's hammer drifted from the blacksmith shop. Chickens scratched beneath the chinaberry tree. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. Betsy looked up from the garden as Palestine came through the gate. You're home. Yes, Mama. Betsy studied her daughter for a moment. How'd it go? Palestine looked toward the woods before answering. I don't reckon I learned what I expected. Betsy smiled knowingly. What'd you learn? Palestine was quiet. Finally she answered. To slow down. Betsy laughed softly. That sounds just like Aunt Hester. Palestine set the empty basket on the porch. I thought she'd teach me about herbs. Instead, she taught me how to look. Betsy's smile grew. That's a better place to begin. Just then, Preston came from the forge and sat down in the porch rocking chair. How was your first afternoon? Palestine grinned. I carried an empty basket nearly all day. Preston chuckled. Sounds like honest work. And she showed me sang. Preston raised his eyebrows. Did she now? Palestine nodded. She dug it so carefully. She said if she'd hurried, she'd have ruined it. That's true of more than roots. Palestine looked thoughtfully at her father. He nodded towards the woods. Anything worth doing is worth taking your time. For a moment no one spoke. The evening breeze stirred through the hickory leaves overhead. Palestine looked across the yard. Yesterday she would have seen only chores waiting to be done. Now she noticed the evening breeze stirring the leaves of the old oak tree, the rich smell of freshly turned earth in Mama's garden, the coolness beneath the tree where the day's heat could never quite reach. She smiled. The world hadn't changed. She had. As the supper bell rang from the kitchen, Palestine followed her family toward the house. Tomorrow she would return to the mountain, but tonight, home somehow felt richer than it had the day before. Sometimes the greatest lessons begin long before we realize we're being taught. Before Palestine learned the names of the mountain healing plants, she learned to slow her steps, open her eyes, and cherish what God had placed around her. The mountain had begun to teach, but more importantly, so had the people God placed in her path. Until our next episode, may the Lord keep you wherever you